Since I first became a rabbi, I've always ended the silent Amidah with the following meditation. The meditation is to honor the rabbis who have come before me and have led congregation with their total beings and all of their hearts, understanding that balance between the work of being a leader and bringing their own hearts and their deepest connections and emotions to what they do. And this honors them, but it's also a meditation that's meant to honor the memory of Leo Beck, who wrote this meditation, and he recited it on the eve of Kol Nidre in 1935. Shortly after Kol Nidre, he was arrested and he was sent to Theresienstadt. And he wrote the following: "Take away my shame, lift my anxiety, absolve me of my sin, and enable me to pray before thee with gladness of heart, to pursue thy commandments and thy Torah and the joy of holiness. Grant me to bring happiness to all your children, to exalt and ennoble your faithful, to spread goodness and mercy and blessing in the world. Humble and arrogant, who have tried to pervert me with falsehood, while I have sought my happiness in serving you. Save me from weakness and from faltering and from any evil trait. Illumine my eyes with the light of your deliverance. Help your people. Imbue the heart of your people with reverence and with awe before your majesty. Strengthen them with your love. Guide them to walk in the path of your righteousness. Kindle in their hearts the light of this day, this night, the holiness of this day of holiness, and bring them to possess the inheritance that you have set for them speedily, speedily, and our time soon." And as I said, shortly after his recitation of this, he was arrested and sent to Theresienstadt. Good evening, everybody. And again, good Yontif. I always like to begin my sermons on this night and important nights with a story, and often a story that will contain some humor. Typically, it'll be about some experience that I had in the past year, and usually it's to make some kind of point. This year, we will agree, things are pretty serious. Our challenge as individuals and as a nation are great. I won't make light of this moment, but permit me to tell you about one very unusual experience that your rabbi had this past year. It took place late January 2020. Toby and I were waiting for a flight from Fort Lauderdale to go to Texas. And there was a crowd at the gate. And whenever I see crowds that are waiting to get on a plane, I always look at the people and I try to discern who's from the place of departure and who is traveling home. It's usually pretty easy with certain Midwestern cities and flights that leave from Palm Beach, for example. But on this particular flight, there was one guy who was waiting in line who captured my attention. He was wearing a plaid shirt, tight jeans, cowboy boots, and a black cowboy hat. Before going to the gate, I had been reading the sports page in the Sun Sentinel, and I learned that the night before was the last rodeo of the season in South Florida. Yes, there are rodeos in South Florida. And I looked at this guy with the boots and the hat, and I thought to myself, I hope I get to sit next to him. Now, I've outgrown my desire to be a cowboy, but I also have never met one. So I get on the plane, and sure enough, guess what? It happened. I was sitting next to the cowboy. He was young, like early 20s. So we sit down in our seats, and by way of background, you should know something about me, and that is I love to engage with strangers. I see each one of these as an opportunity for some kind of encounter that could be meaningful. So I asked him, I said, what brought you to Fort Lauderdale? And he said to me, I ride horses and steer in the rodeo. I asked him how he did. And this young man, with a twang that truly challenged me, said, I won. And he said, I was this year's #1 overall rider in the rodeo. I felt like I was sitting next to LeBron James of the rodeo. So immediately I wished him a mazel tov. No, I really didn't say mazel tov. I said, congratulations. And he told me a little bit about his life in the rodeo. Like a rabbinic dynasty, he was 3rd-generation cowboy. And it was pretty fascinating. He told me that in his short years doing this, he had broken just about every bone in his body. And then the question comes, so what do you do, sir? And I said to him, nothing quite as exciting as riding steer in a rodeo. I said, I'm a rabbi. And he said, you mean like a Jewish pastor? And I said, yeah. And then he asked me what my life is like. And so I paused for a moment and I thought, well, not too unlike yours, I said. We have our ups and downs. Sometimes it's very tough to stay on course. But like you, I'm in front of crowds trying not to get thrown. And I really never know what is next. I said, I've been thrown off a few times, but I've tried to get back on. Well, little did I know that just a few weeks later, it would be really hard to stay on the horse and that life would knock us around quite a bit. Well, we laugh. He asked me if I minded that he got drunk. He said his body was so sore, and I said, hey, let me buy you a whiskey. And then he said, I can't wait to tell my family. They'll never believe that a rabbi bought me a whiskey. You know, we're Baptist. And I said to him, well, first share the news that you won the rodeo. And he laughed. And we sat together. We spoke a little bit more, but before long, he was sound asleep. Well, nothing quite so funny has happened since then. In the midst of COVID and quarantines and all the sorrow that has ensued, I want to tell you that there have been a few beautiful moments. And I've been able and privileged to be a part of some of those beautiful moments. Life cycle celebrations have been very difficult, but they have been especially meaningful. Families, had to decide, do we postpone or do we go ahead and do it privately or do we do it on Zoom? And sometimes there was no choice. I've shared in a few very beautiful celebrations. The Faintuck Hoax Son's Bris was the first one on Zoom with over 300 people from all over the world there. The Spielfogels, the Lippy Reimers, the Sheriff's baby girl's naming. And doing these ceremonies was an affirmation of belonging to a people and affirming our traditions, that we won't give them up. We don't give up that which roots us, that which defines us, even under these conditions. But by far the most intensely beautiful experience for me have been the weddings. I've officiated at a wedding with very few people present besides the bride and groom. I've done some weddings with as many as 10 people, appropriately distanced and wearing masks. By the way, the families don't get kippot anymore with their names in them, but rather they have face masks with the names of the bride and the groom. Well, there was one day that was particularly memorable for me. I did a funeral, which was terribly sad. Just a few people from the immediate family were present. Family and friends were together far away watching on Zoom. Then I left the cemetery and I drove back to this sanctuary to do a wedding with a bride and a groom. And only 2 people were present in this room. It was during a time of a large spike in COVID cases. And I remember standing apart on the bima. They were under the chuppah, which was in front by the steps, and I was in front of the Aron Kodesh. And there were only 2 people there, only 2 people. The bride was wearing the most magnificent wedding dress, and the groom looked very handsome in his tuxedo. Their eyes were smiling, and they were so excited. It could have been a wedding in the presence of 1,000 people, but there were just 2 people. Their love was palpable. What they were doing, I experienced as such an extraordinary expression of hope. Weddings are always about hope. It's the beginning of a new family. It's about fulfilling dreams, and it's about dreams for the future. And during this time when there is so much despair and so much uncertainty, to be able to step out and say that I'm not going to give in to this despair. I'm going to live with a dream for the future. It felt so powerful. Their joy was palpable. And there was something else that I realized under the chuppah that evening, that these friends and these lovers are uniting their lives together, as well as all who choose to marry, in order to help overcome a certain level of existential loneliness. It's always true, but it just felt so much more true during these days. Two individuals coming together to share their lives together. In the very beginning of Genesis, of the creation story, God says it's not good for a man to be alone. And so God created a partner for him. It isn't good to be alone. And although there are exceptions, so many people today, so many people around us who are alone are truly suffering. When I introduce the 7 blessings, the Sheva Brachot, at a wedding ceremony, I indicate that built into creation was the hope that a person would find another person with whom to be intimate and share life's most significant moments, another person with whom to create a home, with whom to build a future. These two will be friends and lovers, as it says in the Sheva Brachot, Re'im ha'ahuvim. That's the language that we use, friends who are lovers. And I know the wedding ceremony is about sanctifying that relationship. In our worldview, we were not created to live alone. Our response to loneliness is to affirm and sanctify faithful relationships. But more than that, the couple understands that they're part of a people. They're part of a community. The language of the ceremony says that, and they understand that as they stand under the chuppah, under normal circumstances. We're not to be alone. The great historian and futurist Yuval Harari has written about the concept of the survival of the fittest. I know that you all remember that Darwinian notion. Harari indicated that the survival of the fittest is not about the strongest, most powerful individual, but the fittest are those who understand they have to join together with others. They have to be in a group. They have to be part of the creation of community. And so they're people that understand they have to help each other and allow themselves to be helped. They have to reach out and visit with each other. They give each other love and encouragement. They critique each other too in order to help them grow. And they see to each other's needs. As we consider these days, we know there's a plague within the plague. And the plague within the plague is the plague of loneliness. We have learned that anxiety, fear, depression, suicide are heavily manifested in this pandemic. We know about these situations. We hear about them amongst our friends and amongst family members. We read about them in the newspaper. There's such an uptick in these terrible, terrible situations of people becoming so depressed that they become suicidal. People are so anxious and so fearful. The force that's driving these mental health issues is loneliness. We get some relief, or we think we get relief from the technology we use, but it's not real and it's not sustainable for the human condition, for real interpersonal needs. What we're learning is that technology creates an illusion of connection. It's good for a while and it has filled in very well here, but we know it won't sustain a community over years. And even after hours on Zoom or Facebook, we crave to be connected. And that connection can only be found through face-to-face relationships. You know, as I do, that there are so many people who are alone and have been suffering terribly. And that deeper sense of loneliness has created a lot of personal angst and other destructive behaviors. From the very beginning of the pandemic, we attempted to reach out to everybody in this congregation who was alone. We wanted everyone to know that there are others here and people who care about them. So there were lots of phone calling that was done. And by the way, not only were some people uplifted to receive these calls, but it was very clear that the people making the calls were reinforced about the power of giving and reaching out to another and making connections. In this process, I have discovered is that there are a lot of people alone and who aren't particularly lonely also. These are people that may be used to being alone, like some of you, and comfortable with yourselves, and you're waiting it out with a sense of optimism that this will be over soon. But I also know there are people who are alone and feeling pretty desperate for human contact. We have seen and we learn other things too. There are people living at home with others, with another, or with a few members of their family and still feel this great sense of loneliness. Shut in, we are distanced from those who we're used to seeing, the people we work with, friends. We know that we need relationships in our life. Everyone in every age has had its own particular angst. When we think of the elderly who know that they're the limits of their time and wonder when they will be touched again. I've heard grandparents say that after a distanced meeting with their kids and their grandkids, they'll say, "Can I just slip a hug in?" And they're told, no, it's not safe. And it's understandable that that's what they would be told, but it feels so awful for grandparents to live for those hugs. And we feel deeply for children who are separated from other children, children who really need socialization. And the experiment of opening schools at this time has not yet proven to be sustainable. We shall see. And so many people, so many parents simply don't want to take the risk. And we've seen and we've learned other things also. People living at home with others who feel this great sense of loneliness, shut in, they are distanced from the people they're living with. We need many relationships in our lives. The sense of loneliness is also felt by people who are with others, yet there's a sense that the other isn't really listening to them, or a sense that you're not being cared for. And so although you're with another, you feel as if you're alone. We know this, that one can go to bed with another and feel like they're all by themselves. It's true. Simply being with another is not enough. We need more. COVID's taught us a lot of lessons. Loneliness and the challenge and opportunities of being alone are simply two, and they're very profound ones. As we witness the pain of loneliness, we can also recognize that there is a lot for us to learn from being alone. Sometimes life's greatest lessons are learned when we are alone. For when we're alone, we have time to think and time to dream. And that's a very good thing. Another lesson is that we have realized that we typically are simply too busy. We're constantly seeking distractions. We're constantly on the move, running towards things and running away from things. When Jacob went out on his journey and put his head on a stone to go to sleep, he had a dream. And in the dream, there were angels on a ladder. And he woke from his dream and he said, "Surely God is in this place with me. And I didn't know." Sometimes in order to really find one's heart in one's dreams and even one's God, one needs to be alone. And being alone, we can feel a connection to something deeper. Almost every religion and almost every founder of religion had a transcendent moment that took place in solitude. You know which religion didn't? Ours. At Sinai, 600,000 people stood together. 600,000 people received revelation. And at Sinai, when Moses was alone with God, God says to him, "Lech, raid, go down, be with the people." That's where we find our religious community. There we have a sense of belonging. We want to be with our people. So there's a tension. On one hand, we often fear being alone. We fear being lonely. We prefer distractions. We're addicted to our devices, emails, texts, Facebook, Instagram. Perhaps we think we can escape our loneliness. But being alone and quiet, listening to something deeper can also be rewarding. It takes an act of will to separate, but it can bring us to greater understanding. And there's also this realization from the time that we're very young, we need some time alone. Leave me alone, a child will say. I want to be in my room by myself. Let me have my space. Let me have my time. We all feel that. But when we don't choose it, when a viral enemy quarantines us, and when we don't know when, if ever, we can be fully together, then it's very different. Then it's frightening, and then it's lonely. Then it's anxiety-provoking, and then it can create darkness. The Hebrew letter that begins the Torah, do you know what letter it is? It's Bet. Bet. In our tradition where every detail takes on significance, the rabbis asked, why Bet? Why not Aleph? Aleph is one, like the Holy One. The Ten Commandments begin with Aleph. But the Torah begins with Bet, two. The rabbis teach us that it's because it takes two to be in relationship, and that's where we find life's deepest meaning. A wonderful rabbi, the late Harold Schulweis, once taught that God can be found in the space above us. God can be found in the space within us, but God is most likely to be found in the space between us. We inherited a tradition that taught us that being with someone who is sick, bringing them comfort, touching their hand, giving them a kiss, can take away some trouble and pain. There are times when I visit people in a hospital, and as I leave the room, they'll say to me, Rabbi, thanks for the visit. I'm already feeling better. And this is where the cruelty brought on the virus was experienced, as people have had to be sick alone. There are people amongst us, you've heard me say this, who had parents that were stricken by COVID-19 and died alone. And there are others in our congregation who've had adult children who were hospitalized and nobody could be with them. They died alone. I saw an elderly congregant not long ago who doesn't have family here through the window of a nursing home. And all I could do was wave. Our tradition teaches that the loneliness of dying demands that a dying person never be left alone. Our presence with loved ones matter. Speaking to them, stroking their hair, holding their hands. Does it create more peace for them? I'm not sure, but I think it does. And then we have shomrim, after somebody dies, guardians of a body, a sign of kavod, of honor and respect. And through so much of this time, there could be no shomrim. In funerals, mourners need family and friends around them to support them and comfort them. The tradition knew what contemporary psychologists have taught. After death, we feel so lonely. And that is why we gather. That's the purpose of Shiva. These have been really difficult days. And also these days have taught us lessons that we're going to need to carry with us when this, God willing, will be over. We think of this period of the high holidays as beginning with Rosh Hashanah and ending with Yom Kippur, but there's a broader view that I would like to teach you about. And that is the period began with Tisha B'Av 7 weeks ago. We read the book of Eicha, Lamentations. And Eicha begins with a chilling trope. Eicha yashva badad hayirabati. How lonely is the city. She sits alone. She that was filled with people now sits alone. We're mourning the loneliness of a city and a people who are no longer together. It's a story of abandonment and loss that we observed 7 weeks ago. When we're alone, we go back to that very primitive feeling of abandonment. But 7 weeks later now, we're returning to a holy city. We return to Jerusalem and its temple for the sacred rituals that bring comfort, the comfort of forgiveness. Yom Kippur marks this. Our loneliness is transformed into divine closeness, forgiveness, and togetherness. And we feel that when we come into the sanctuary on this night. So in our prayers on this day, we are identified with each other. All of the confessionals are done in the third person singular. It's we, it's us. Life's most profound moments, we should never be alone. The psalmist reminds us that we have hope, that ultimately we're part of something larger, something divine. So we hope and pray that we can feel the connection through memory, hope, and love, and realize the things that are eternal within us. And we learn and we all know that none of us are whole by ourselves. We need each other, our loved ones, our families, our friends, our community. So I want to say this as I conclude. My friends, you have stood up and you have stood together, even as we are apart. We should have such great pride in this community.